Tina
자기야.
Patrick rushes through the
잘 지내고
suffocating
있었어.
heat of a Los Angeles
일은 거의
Santa
다
Ana
끝나가.
wind, fearing that being
있나
late
봐.
to her shift at the Gilded Crane could cost her job. The upscale restaurant demands perfection, and her anxiety peaks when she's assigned to serve a VIP table. She locks eyes with Min Ji, a feared figure in the Korean underworld. As Tina answers a call from her brother in fluent Korean, she unknowingly captures Min Ji's attention. In that moment, her life shifts, and she realizes she's become entangled in a dangerous game far beyond her control. Before I tell you next what happened between Tina and Min Ji, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. This video will make you feel like being admired too. Now, let's dive into it. The Santa Ana winds howled through the canyons, carrying the scent of dry brush and desperation into the heart of Los Angeles. Outside the Gilded Crane, the palm trees whipped violently against the bruised violet sky. But inside, the air was a pressurized vacuum of curated luxury and hushed conversations. Tina Patrick stood in the cramped staff restroom, her fingers trembling as she pressed a damp paper towel against the collar of her white button-down. A single, microscopic drop of soy sauce mocked her from the fabric. To anyone else, it was a smudge. To Tina, it was a neon sign of incompetence that could cost her the invisibility she had spent 2 years perfecting. She was a ghost in a city of stars, a polyglot who had buried her gift under a black polyester apron and a name tag that felt like a shield. Here, she was just the server, a background character in the lives of the elite. If she lost this job, the delicate wire transfer she sent to Seoul every month would snap, and her brother would be left defenseless. "Tina, get out here now!" The manager's voice through the door was sharp enough to draw blood. Tina smoothed her dark bangs, tucked the ends of her hair neatly under, and stepped out. The kitchen was a chaotic symphony of clashing pans and shouted orders, but as she moved toward the dining room, the noise died a sudden, unnatural death. Marco, the floor manager, was waiting by the pass, his face a shade of gray that matched the silver linens. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the heavy oak doors of the private VIP alcove. "Table 4, Marco whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "Everything must be perfect. No mistakes, no lingering, no eye contact unless he initiates. Do you understand?" "It's just a business dinner, Marco," Tina replied, though her pulse began to drum a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "It is not a dinner. It is an audience," Marco corrected, finally meeting her gaze. "Min Ji is in the building. Don't let the suit fool you, Tina. That man breathes a different kind of air than the rest of us." Tina took the heavy leather menus, her spine stiffening with a professional resolve born of survival. She pushed through the doors into the main dining room. The atmosphere had shifted. The usual chatter of socialites had been replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. At table 4, the man sat with a stillness that felt predatory. Min Ji was a masterpiece of sharp angles and dark intentions. His undercut was precise, every hair in place despite the gale outside, and the tattoos snaking up his neck disappeared into the collar of a black suit that cost more than Tina's annual rent. He didn't look up as she approached. He was leaning forward, his hand resting thoughtfully on his chin, exuding a contemplative gravity that made the air around him feel thick and hard to breathe.
Tina stepped into his peripheral vision, her hand instinctively reaching for the phone in her apron pocket, a nervous habit she couldn't break. Her brother was supposed to call for his nightly check-in soon. She cleared her throat, the sound feeling like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady despite the predatory aura radiating from the man in the chair. "I'm Tina, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Min-ji didn't move, but Tina felt his focus shift toward her like a spotlight. It was the first time in 2 years she felt truly seen, and it terrified her. The service continued like a dance on the edge of a blade. Tina moved with a practiced robotic grace, placing crystal stemware and silver carafes with a silence that mirrored the heavy atmosphere of the booth. Min-ji remained a mountain of granite, his presence commanding the very oxygen in the room. He didn't speak to his companions, 2 men in identical charcoal suits who sat with the rigid posture of soldiers, but his silence was louder than any shout. It was the silence of a man who didn't need to demand respect, because he already owned the room. Tina reached for the bottle of vintage Bordeaux to refill Min-ji's glass, her mind racing through the mental checklist that kept her safe. Eyes down, shoulders soft, be the ghost. But then the vibration started. It wasn't the dull hum of a notification. It was the rhythmic, persistent pulse of a direct call coming from the pocket of her black apron. Her heart skipped. It was 8 p.m. in Los Angeles, which meant it was 1 p.m. in Seoul. This was the window her brother, Leo, used to confirm he had made it to his university library safely, away from the shadows of the debt collectors they had left behind. She retreated toward the shadows of a nearby service station, shielded by a large floral arrangement. She knew she should ignore it. She knew the rules, but the vibration felt like a scream. In her world, an unexpected deviation from the schedule meant a different kind of danger. Panic, sharp and cold, flared in her chest. Glancing back, she saw Min-ji's head slightly tilted, his attention seemingly fixed on a document held by one of his men. Taking a calculated risk, she slipped the phone from her pocket and pressed it to her ear, ducking her head so her dark bangs obscured her face. "Leo, why are you calling now?" she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of native liquid Korean. Her accent was flawless, the soulful, melodic lilt of a girl raised in the heart of Busan, untouched by the flat vowels of California. "I told you to stay in the light. I told you I'd send the money by Friday. Talk to me." The voice on the other end was frantic, a quick update about a security check at his dormitory, but Tina barely heard the explanation. The moment she spoke, the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to vanish.
The heavy clink of silver against porcelain at table 4 stopped. Tina froze, the phone still pressed to her ear. The silence was absolute. Slowly, she turned her head. Min-ji was no longer looking at his companions. He had shifted in his seat, his hand dropping from his chin to the mahogany table. His dark, piercing eyes were locked directly onto hers. There was no anger in his gaze, only a terrifying, predatory curiosity. He looked at her not as a server, but as a riddle that had suddenly solved itself in his favor. The 2 men with him were staring as well, their expressions caught between shock and suspicion. Tina's breath hitched. She realized with a sickening jolt that she hadn't just broken a rule, she had revealed a weapon she had spent years trying to disarm. Min-ji's lips didn't move, but the intensity of his stare felt like a physical touch, pinning her to the spot. He had been looking for a ghost, and he had finally found one that spoke his language. The air in the private alcove had curdled from professional tension into something thick and suffocating. Tina stood paralyzed, her phone still clutched in a white-knuckled grip, as the echoes of her Busan dialect seemed to hang in the air like a confession. She awaited the reprimand, the firing, or the expulsion from the room. Instead, Minji did something far more unsettling. He smiled, a slow, razor-thin tilt of the lips that never reached his predatory eyes. He raised a single hand, beckoning Marco, who had been hovering near the kitchen doors like a ghost awaiting a sentence. Marco scrambled forward, bowing so low his forehead nearly brushed the linen. Minji spoke in English, his voice a low, melodic baritone that vibrated with absolute authority. "The service is inconsistent," Minji remarked, though his eyes never left Tina's face. "I find I prefer the attention of this one. Send the others away. She will be the only one to touch this table for the remainder of the evening." Marco's eyes darted to Tina, wide with a mixture of pity and terror, before he stammered his assent and cleared the room of the junior servers. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing Tina inside with the silence of the three men. The two associates shifted, their hands moving instinctively toward the buttons of their suit jackets, but a sharp glance from Minji stilled them. "Dessert," Minji commanded, his gaze tracing the lines of Tina's face as if he were memorizing a map. Tina's legs felt like lead as she moved to the sideboard to prepare the tray. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body was bound by the terrifying gravity of his focus. She returned to the table with 3 plates of black sesame cheesecake, her movements mechanical. As she set the plate before him, Minji didn't reach for his fork. Instead, he leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, the silk of his trousers whispering against the chair. "You have a very specific accent, Tina," he said, switching back to Korean. His voice was intimate, a sharp contrast to the coldness of his tattoos. "It isn't the practiced, hollow tongue of a student. It's the sound of a girl who spent her summers near the Jagalchi market, a girl who learned to haggle before she learned to pray." Tina felt the blood drain from her extremities. She kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the gold-rimmed plate. "I was just a server, sir. I didn't mean to—" "You were never just a server," he interrupted, his tone shifting to something more clinical, more dangerous. He reached out, his fingers ghosting near her wrist but not touching, a display of restraint that was more threatening than a grab. "Linguistics is a high-level skill, yet you hide here, scrubbing stains in a kitchen for pennies. Why does a woman with a gift for tongues choose to be silent?" The psychological weight of the question pressed down on her. He wasn't just asking about her language, he was probing the perimeter of her life, looking for the cracks she had spent years sealing with fear. "I like the quiet," she whispered, her voice cracking. Minji picked up his silver fork, turning it slowly so it caught the light. "The quiet is for the dead, Tina. For the living, silence is a commodity. And I think you've been underselling yourself." He took a small, deliberate bite of the cake, his eyes never breaking their hold on hers. "Tell me about the boy on the phone. Tell me why he sounds like a person who is being hunted." The mention of Leo was the final blow. Tina looked up, her professional mask shattering to reveal the raw, jagged edges of her desperation. She realized then that the order hadn't just changed for the evening, her entire life had been reclassified. She was no longer a ghost, she was an asset, and Minji was a man who never left an asset unclaimed. The Santa Ana winds had died down to a dry, haunting whistle by the time Tina's shift finally ended, but the stillness offered no comfort. The fluorescent lights of the restaurant's rear exit flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows across the asphalt of the alleyway. Tina clutched her bag to her chest, her heart still echoing the terrifying rhythm of Minji's interrogation. She had waited an extra 20 minutes in the locker room, hoping the darkness would swallow her, but as she stepped into the cool night air, she realized the shadows were already occupied. Waiting at the end of the narrow passage was a long obsidian black sedan. It sat idling, a low mechanical growl vibrating through the pavement and up into the soles of Tina's tired feet.
The headlights were off, but the amber glow of the parking lights caught the edges of the chrome, making the vehicle look like a predator resting in the tall grass. The rear door swung open with a heavy pressurized thud. A man stepped out, one of the associates from Table 4. He didn't move toward her, nor did he reach for the weapon Tina knew was tucked beneath his tailored jacket. He simply stood by the open door, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the streetlights. Mr. G is not the man who enjoys the city's public transit, the man said, his voice as flat and emotionless as the tinted glass behind him. He has requested the pleasure of your company for a brief drive. He believes your walk home would be ill-advised. It wasn't a kidnapping. There were no hands laid upon her, no harsh commands. It was an invitation that carried the weight of a command, a velvet-lined trap that left no room for the word no. Tina looked back at the locked door of the restaurant, then at the gaping darkness of the car's interior. She thought of Leo, alone in Seoul, and the dossier Minji had already begun to build in his mind. She walked forward, her steps heavy, and slid onto the butter-soft leather of the rear seat. The door closed, sealing out the sounds of Los Angeles and replacing them with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The interior smelled of expensive tobacco, sandalwood, and the cold, sharp scent of ozone. To her left, shrouded in the deep gloom of the cabin, sat Minji. He didn't turn to look at her. He was staring out the window at the passing neon blur of the city, the light catching the gold of his watch and the intricate ink on his throat. "You're trembling, Tina," he remarked softly. It wasn't an observation of pity. It was a statement of fact. "There is no need. In my world, fear is a waste of energy. It clouds the mind, and I require your mind to be very, very clear tonight." As the car glided away from the curb, Tina felt the world she knew, the world of tips, double shifts, and hiding, vanishing in the rearview mirror. The leather seats didn't feel like luxury. They felt like the beginning of a cage. She was being collected, pulled into the orbit of a man who didn't believe in coincidences. And as the black car merged into the midnight traffic, she realized the invisible life she had fought so hard for was officially dead. The black sedan moved through the canyon roads with a predatory smoothness, the city lights below flickering like dying embers. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute, save for the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood that clung to the upholstery. Tina kept her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white against the dark fabric of her skirt. She could feel Minji's presence beside her, a cold, calculated weight that seemed to pull the very air from her lungs. He didn't look at her when he finally spoke. His voice was low, devoid of the theatrical menace one might expect from a man of his standing. It was the voice of a man stating a mathematical certainty. "Los Angeles is a city of people pretending to be someone else," Minji began, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the Hollywood Hills. "But you, Tina, you aren't pretending. You are hiding. There's a difference." Tina's throat felt tight, as if the dry Santa Ana winds had followed her into the car. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie. It's a waste of my time and your dignity," he said, finally turning his head. The passing streetlight strobed across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the intricate ink that disappeared beneath his collar. "I know why you left Philadelphia. I know about the incident with the district attorney's office, and I know about the man you were supposed to testify against, the one who made sure your career as a federal interpreter vanished overnight." The mention of her past hit her like a physical blow. The invisible life she had built in L.A. were supposed to be her fortress, but Minji had breached the walls without even trying. He knew about the threats, the shattered windows, and the way she had traded her credentials for a waitress's apron just to stay alive. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I make it my business to know the value of the things I find," he replied. He leaned closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You are a polyglot with a rare mastery of dialects that are difficult to find in our circles. You speak the language of the streets and the boardrooms with equal fluency. Currently, I am involved in a negotiation in Seoul that requires a very specific kind of discretion. My current translators are loyal, but they lack your nuances. They hear words. You hear intentions." He reached into the pocket of his suit and pulled out a sleek obsidian black passport. He placed it on the armrest between them. "I'm offering you a deal, Tina. Come to Seoul, translate for me during these negotiations. In exchange, the man you are running from will find his problems suddenly compounded until he forgets you ever existed. I will provide a new identity, a new history, and enough capital to ensure your brother never has to call you in a panic again." Tina looked at the passport, then back at the man who held her future in his hands. "And if I say no?" Minji tilted his head, a shadow of a smile ghosting across his lips. "Then you return to your shift at the restaurant. You continue to hide in the kitchen, waiting for the day your past finally catches up to you. And it will, Tina. Men like that don't stop looking. But if you come with me, your ghost stays dead. You become someone new, someone under my protection."
The choice was an illusion. To stay was to wait for the end. To go was to step into a gilded cage. As the car turned toward the private hangars of LAX, Tina realized that the price of her silence had just been set, and Minji was the only one who could pay it. The transition from the asphalt of LAX to the interior of Minji's private Gulf Stream was a blur of filtered air and soft ambient lighting. As the jet leveled off at 30,000 feet, the hum of the engines became a distant rhythmic heartbeat, isolating the cabin from the rest of the world. Tina sat in a deep cream-colored leather captain's chair, her reflection in the window ghost-like against the vast, dark expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Across the aisle, Minji had discarded his suit jacket, revealing the stark contrast of his crisp white shirt against the intricate dark ink that climbed his forearms. He wasn't reviewing ledgers or barking orders into a satellite phone. Instead, he was watching her with a quiet intensity that felt more invasive than any interrogation. "You haven't touched your tea," he noted, his voice low and smooth, cutting through the silence of the cabin. Tina glanced at the delicate porcelain cup on the mahogany side table. "I'm not used to all of this, the speed of it." "Comfort is an acquisition, Tina. You'll find you have a natural talent for it," he replied, standing up. He moved with a liquid ease that suggested he was as comfortable in the sky as he was on the ground. He didn't return to his seat. Instead, he sat on the edge of the ottoman directly across from her, encroaching on her personal space in a way that made the cabin feel suddenly, dangerously small. He placed a stack of documents on the table between them, transcripts of intercepted communications from the rival African tech conglomerate they were headed to meet. Translate the third paragraph, not the literal meaning. Tell me what the man behind the words is afraid of. Tina leaned forward, her hair falling over her shoulder as she scanned the complex mixture of technical jargon and regional slang. She worked in silence for a few minutes, her mind slipping into the familiar analytical groove of linguistics. "He's overcompensating," she finally said, her voice gaining a hint of professional confidence. "The use of the formal honorifics here is jagged. He's trying to sound like a king, but he's phrasing his demands like a man who expects to be told no. He doesn't want the territory. He wants a guarantee that you won't humiliate him in front of his board." Minji leaned back, a genuine look of intrigue flickering in his dark eyes. He wasn't looking at the papers, he was looking at the way her eyes lit up when she solved the puzzle. "Most would have told me he was demanding a higher percentage. They see the math, you see the pride. Languages aren't just words, Mr. G. They're maps of how people survive." "Exactly," he murmured, leaning closer. The scent of his sandalwood cologne was intoxicating, a warm anchor in the cold altitude. "People think I brought you along because I need a translator. I have dozens. I brought you because you understand the subtext of survival. You see the world the way I do, as a series of masks and the truth hidden beneath them." For the first time, Tina felt a shift in the power dynamic. It wasn't just her skill he coveted, it was the way her mind worked. In the intimacy of the cabin, with the world 10 miles below them, the fear that had defined her for years began to mix with a heady, terrifying sense of being understood. She wasn't just a tool to him, she was a mirror. And for a man who spent his life surrounded by shadows, that was the most dangerous fascination of all. The humidity of Seoul in the monsoon season felt different than the dry heat of Los Angeles. It was heavy, fragrant with rain and exhaust, and thick with the weight of ancient power. The meeting took place in the back of a traditional hanok house, hidden in the shadows of Gangnam's gleaming skyscrapers. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of cedar and tea, but the atmosphere was electric with the threat of violence. Tina sat slightly behind Minji, her hands resting on her knees, her back as straight as a blade. She had traded her server's apron for a charcoal silk blouse that felt like a second skin. Across the low table sat the elders of the rival syndicate, men whose faces were maps of old scars and hard-won authority. Their lead translator, a man in a stiff suit, droned on in a formal, standardized Seoul dialect, laying out the terms for the tech corridor merger. For an hour, the conversation was a tedious back and forth of numbers and territories. Minji remained a statue of calm, his fingers tracing the rim of a Celadon cup. To anyone else, the deal was proceeding with the clinical precision of a bank transaction. But Tina wasn't just listening to the words. She was tracking the shifts in the rival's body language and the way the younger associate in the corner whispered to his superior. Suddenly, the tone shifted. The rival leader leaned back, offering a final, seemingly generous concession regarding the port rights. His translator relayed the message with a bow, but as he finished, the elder turned to his associate and muttered a single, lightning-fast sentence in a jagged, rural dialect from the far south, a dialect so thick and archaic it was almost a different language. Min-ji's official translator nodded, ready to move to the next point, unaware of the viper that had just been released into the room. Tina's pulse spiked. The elder hadn't confirmed a concession. He had used a slang term for empty bait. He was promising a port that was already under investigation by the Supreme Prosecutor's Office. He was selling Min-ji a burning building. Without waiting for permission, Tina leaned forward, her voice a low, steady hum that cut through the formal silence. She didn't speak in the polite Seoul tongue. She answered in the same jagged southern dialect the elder had used, her tone vibrating with a sudden sharp authority. "The tide is too low at that port for your ships to dock, elder," she said, the dialect flowing from her like a challenge. "Perhaps you should offer him something that isn't already sinking beneath the weight of an indictment." The room went deathless silent. The rival leader froze, his cup halfway to his lips. His eyes widened as he looked at Tina, not as a decoration or a servant, but as a threat. He hadn't expected the black woman in the room to speak the tongue of his ancestors better than his own grandson. Min-ji didn't move a muscle, but Tina saw the flicker of a dark, satisfied grin in the depths of his eyes. He set his cup down with a deliberate click that sounded like a hammer cocking. He didn't need to ask for a translation. He had seen the terror on the rival's face, and he knew that his invisible server had just won him the war before the first shot was even fired. The fluorescent hum of Incheon International Airport felt clinical and cold, a stark contrast to the wood-scented tension of the Gangnam Tea House. They moved through the terminal like a small private army, the sea of travelers parting naturally before Min-ji's stride. Tina walked beside him, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble, her mind a whirlwind of static. In the chaos of the security transition, a window opened. One of Min-ji's men was distracted by a logistics issue with a private hangar, and Min-ji himself was pulled aside by an airport official with a deep bow and a hushed urgent message. For the first time in days, the perimeter around Tina was thin. The crowded terminal beckoned, a labyrinth of exits, bus terminals, and anonymity. She stood near a glass partition, her reflection staring back at her. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. The silk of her blouse, the designer coat draped over her arm, and the way her chin sat higher than it ever had in Los Angeles made her look like someone who belonged in this world of power. To her left, the sign for the public shuttles glowed. She had her passport in her pocket, the new one, the one Min-ji had provided. She could vanish into the heart of Seoul, find Leo, and disappear into the rural provinces. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She looked toward the exit, calculating the seconds it would take to lose herself in the crowd. But as her hand drifted toward the strap of her bag, her mind flashed back to the rival elder's face, the way his eyes had hardened into chips of ice when she had exposed his betrayal. She wasn't just running from a ghost in Philadelphia anymore. She had stepped into a global theater of wolves. If she left Min-ji's side now, she'd be a woman with no country and no protector, a linguist who knew too many secrets and possessed no shield to guard them. The man who had hunted her in America was a common thug compared to the forces she had just challenged in Gangnam. She turned back to see Min-ji. He was watching her. He hadn't moved to stop her. He hadn't signaled his men to close the gap. He simply stood there, 10 paces away, his hands folded behind his back. his dark eyes observing her with a terrifying, calm patience. He was giving her the choice, knowing full well the conclusion she would reach. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a savior. He was a monster, but he was a monster who valued her mind, a predator who saw her as a partner rather than prey. In the invisible life she had left behind, she was always waiting for the blow to fall. Here, the blow had already fallen, and she was still standing. Tina took a breath, the air of the terminal tasting of jet fuel and finality. She turned away from the exit signs and the promise of a frantic, fearful freedom. With steady steps, she walked back across the marble toward the man in the black suit. As she reached his side, In-ji didn't offer a smile or a word of relief. He simply adjusted the collar of her coat, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against her neck, a gesture that was part ownership, part promise. "The car is waiting," he said softly in Korean. "It's time to see your brother." Tina nodded, her choice made. She was no longer running. She was stepping into the center of the storm, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the dark. The penthouse balcony hung over the glittering expanse of Seoul like a glass-bottomed throne, the city's neon arteries pulsing far below with the restless energy of millions. The monsoon rains had cleared, leaving the air crisp and the sky a deep, velvety indigo. Tina stood at the railing, the wind catching the hem of her emerald silk gown. The fabric was heavy and cool, a far cry from the stiff, stained polyester of the life she had left behind in Los Angeles. She wasn't alone. In the shadows of the living room, her brother Leo was sleeping in a guest suite that cost more than her father had earned in a decade. Min-ji had kept his word. The debts were gone, the threats had been silenced, and Leo was finally enrolled in a university where he didn't have to look over his shoulder. The heavy glass door slid open with a whisper, and Min-ji stepped out onto the balcony. He had shed his tie, the top buttons of his shirt undone to reveal the ink that marked his skin, a visual reminder of the violence he commanded. He didn't stand beside her. He stood behind her, his presence a warm, solid weight that anchored her to this new, dizzying height. "The reports from the morning session are in," he said, his voice a low vibration against the back of her neck. He held out the tablet, but he didn't look at the screen. He was watching the way the moonlight reflected in Tina's eyes. "The board is hesitant. They think I'm overreaching in the African tech sector." Tina scrolled down on the device with a precision that had become second nature. She didn't just see the numbers, she heard the voices behind them. She heard the fear in the director's silence and the greed in their concessions. "They aren't hesitant about the reach, Min-ji," she said, her Korean now effortless and sharp, the language of a woman who shaped the world rather than hid from it. "They're hesitant because they think you're distracted. They want to see if you'll blink. If you push the merger by 3 o'clock tomorrow, you'll catch them before they have time to form a unified front." Min-ji leaned in, his chin resting near her shoulder. For a man who ruled through fear and absolute loyalty, he looked at Tina with something that bordered on reverence and utmost respect. To the world, he was a monster. To him, she was the only truth he had ever found. 3 o'clock, he repeated, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'll tell the men to prepare the documents for further action." He reached out, his hand covering hers on the railing, the gold on her finger, a ring he had placed there not as a shackle, but as a badge of office and honor, glinted in the city lights. 6 months ago, she had been a server scrubbing soy sauce stains off a collar, praying to be invisible. Now, she was the silent architect of an empire, the only person in the world whose whisper could move Minji's hand. She looked out over the horizon, at the sprawling, beautiful, and dangerous city that was now her new home. She had traded the safety of the shadows for the lethal brilliance of the sun, and as Minji's arms wrapped around her, pulling her back against his chest, Tina realized she didn't miss the quiet. She had finally found her voice and composure, and in this world of wolves, it was the only sound that mattered.